So you want to know more about whether B.H. Roberts, one of the Latter-day Saints' foremost theologians, historians, and apologists, lost faith in the Book of Mormon's historicity at the end of his life. This is a debate that has divided historians for decades, and it came to a fever point with the publication of previously inaccessible documents from B.H. Roberts in the 1980s. It also cuts to the core of some of the most important debates concerning Book of Mormon historicity and its origins. It's an issue that demonstrates that just because we have lots of documentation does not mean that the answers are easy. It can be, to a degree, a Rorschach test, forcing some to believe one thing and another, that you bring as much into your interpretation as the document is giving to you. It's also an example of where context and method are important in the historian's craft. So this is part of my series on the Mormon history war in the 1970s and the 1980s. I did a previous video on a controversial 1974 MHA presidential address this last Monday. This coming Monday, I'm doing one on the Mark Hoffman forgeries and bombings. But today, I wanted to dip a bit back in time to understand where these debates came from and why they came to a head in the 1970s and 80s. So make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you're not missing any of these contributions. In this video, I'm going to provide some background to B.H. Roberts and his views on the Book of Mormon. Then I'm going to discuss how Roberts investigated new questions concerning the Book of Mormon's historicity, including a production of a work that came to be known as the Studies of the Book of Mormon, which is in actuality 3 distinct documents. I'll then provide an overview of how Roberts presented these ideas to church leaders in a series of meetings that prompted a lot of debate. And then I'll analyze my own thought, or I'll provide some of my own analysis and thoughts on how Roberts evolved in his thinking here. And then I'll finally reflect on the later debates over this topic, especially when these documents became known in the 1970s and 1980s. Just as a warning before we get started though, this is a topic where there's no clear-cut solution. And those who come out and say with certainty that Roberts believed this or that and this is the lesson are probably a bit ahead of their skis, because this is a topic that requires reflection and deep analysis. And I hope I can model that a little bit in this video, but more importantly, I hope I can provide some tools for you so that you can investigate this topic and come to your own conclusion. It would be difficult to overstate how significant B.H. Roberts was to the LDS Church in the early 20th century. He was born in England, migrated with his family to Utah at a young age, spent his early years as a miner and got involved with drinking and gambling, but then was sent on a mission, really reformed his ways, and became one of the church's foremost theologians, ministers, and writers. While on his mission to Tennessee, he did a public debate with a prominent Campbellite minister where they debated the contents of the Book of Mormon, which really set the stage for his later apologetic works. And one of his greatest moments early in life was following the tragedy of where several LDS converts and missionaries were killed by an anti-Mormon mob in the South. He had to go in and retrieve the Mormon missionaries' bodies so they could return them to Utah. He knew they would be on the lookout for Mormon missionaries, so he dressed up like this. Here you have an image of him putting on the clothing later on to disguise himself as he went and successfully got those bodies, building the myth of B.H. Roberts as a real doer. He then became the faith's chief historian and theologian. The later LDS theologian Sterling McMurrin said that Roberts wasn't a first-rate historian or theologian, but he was the best the church had. He wrote a number of influential history books. He edited the History of the Church series, that 7-volume series that's in the voice of Joseph Smith, but has a much more complicated history. Maybe I'll do a video series on that at some point. He wrote the really huge comprehensive history of the church series a few years later. He wrote books on John Taylor, Missouri, and Nauvoo. And then in the theology realm, he wrote a number of important books that framed how Latter-day Saints would understand their doctrine and scripture. He wrote The New Witness for God, which was on the Book of Mormon. He wrote 70s Course on Theology, a multi-volume series that tries to offer a systematic view of Mormon theology. He wrote The Mormon Doctrine of Deity, which was in reality a debate with a Christian over Mormon conceptions of God. And then his final massive manuscript was The Truth, the Way, the Life, which didn't get published, but that's a story for another video. Even if that was enough, he wrote a novel, Corianton, that would later become a play. And then in the political realm, he was also a politician. He clashed with the church over their political manifesto in the 1890s, which I covered in a previous video. And then he was elected to Congress in 1898 and denied his seat because he was a polygamist. So needless to say, he was a very controversial and very energetic figure. But he was also a different type of thinker than many of the LDS leaders, theologians, and authors, because he embraced what scholars call as modernism, or at least to a degree he embraced it. The idea that modern scholarship should prompt a reassessment of our theological foundations. This was an era of American innovation, where many Americans, especially at institutions of higher learning, accept different ways of knowledge that disrupt the traditional orthodoxy and ecclesiastical control over knowledge. Perhaps the most prominent example is William James, the philosophy and psychology professor at Harvard University, who has a correspondence with B.H. Roberts, who embraces the concept of pragmatism, to where you can disrupt traditional orthodoxies by just asking different questions, and you don't always have to expect a systematic view of things, that you can embrace these different claims to truth without having to claim them as fraud and throwing out the entire world views. That type of framework, this pragmatic mindset, by the way, is what allows the rise of religious scholarship, because now you can study religion without having to make a say on their truth claims. And what's important here is that B.H. Roberts praised, to a degree, much of this modernist scholarship, saying that they are providing the tools that we can better assess our own faith. Though, of course, he always argued that we need to go back to those fundamental core claims. But this made Roberts different from someone like Joseph Fielding Smith, who was an apostle at about the same time, who said that we need to be rejecting this modern scholarship and just stick to our fundamentals. And that's what's going to be a key issue of an eventual big fight between B.H. Roberts and Joseph Fielding Smith that maybe I'll cover in a future video. Go ahead and drink if you're doing the drinking game. But this context of modernism, of embracing new tools, not being so determined on certain answers, but instead being focused on the process, should be the key that we unlock Roberts' views on the Book of Mormon. So let me close this prefatory remarks by talking about how Roberts saw the Book of Mormon as key. This comes from his book, The New Witness for God, published in 1909, which kind of sets a stakes for why the Book of Mormon is important. That is to say, if the origin of the Book of Mormon could be proved to be other than that set forth by Joseph Smith, if the book itself could be proved to be other than it claims to be, then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its message and doctrines, which in some respects may be said to have arisen out of the Book of Mormon, must fall. For if that book is other than it claims to be, if its origin is other than ascribed to it by Joseph Smith, then Joseph Smith says that which is untrue. He is a false prophet of the false prophets. Secondary evidence in support of truth, like secondary causes in natural phenomena, may be of first-rate importance and mighty factors in the achievement of God's purposes. That certainty, however, of course, is going to be challenged later on, and that's the topic of this video. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I try to do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present on Wednesday, and I pull back the curtains on the historian's craft every Friday, including series like this where we dig into a particular topic, look at the sources behind it, examine how historians are approaching it, and what we can learn, hoping that you can come to your own conclusion. And this video in particular is not just part of my Friday series, the So You Want to Know More About X series, but it's also part of my broader series on battles over Mormon history in the late 20th century, which I promise we're going to get to here. If you want to support this type of work, please become a member of this channel, where for a very nominal fee, you can get early access to these videos that are usually up a few days before they're open to the public. You get little icons next to your name, and most importantly, you know you are supporting this channel so that I and my wonderful producer Anthony can put in the time necessary to do these topics justice. I also recommend recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter. I send out new newsletters every other week or so that just provide links and updates and events that you will, I promise, be interested in following. And then every first Wednesday of the month, I do a live discussion where I answer your questions. The next one is going to be on April 1st, no foolin', at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and I'll be discussing these Mormon history debates. So take your questions from this video, the other videos, the Mark Hoffman video that's coming up, and I will try to answer those questions. It should be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to B.H. Roberts. Challenges to Book of Mormon truth claims were far from new in the 20th century. The first published critique of the Book of Mormon that tries to place it as a product of Joseph Smith appeared within months of the Book of Mormon's publication in 1830. But with the rise of modernist scholarship, the same academic developments that I mentioned earlier that B.H. Roberts appreciated, also came a new type of critique of the Book of Mormon that reflected new scholarly advances. And in 1921, a Mormon located in Washington, D.C., William Ryder, wrote the Mormon apostle James Talmage, who had his own academic background, with difficult questions that he had learned from his non-Mormon friend John Couch. These are questions very different than the previous evangelical critiques of the Book of Mormon, and Talmage did not have a good answer, so he eventually forwards them on to B.H. Roberts, the foremost apologist. Here is excerpts from the book. The published version of the studies of the Book of Mormon, which includes Ryder's letter. You can go ahead and pause if you want to read the questions yourself. In summary, they ask about grammatical constructions of Indian tongues, paleontology data concerning the horse, idea of whether the Jewish population had access to steel, use of words like scimitars, or even whether silk was available in the Book of Mormon. So things that argue that what we find in the Book of Mormon does not square with what scientists say was actually around in the ancient Americas. So Talmage passes on these questions to Roberts, and Roberts confesses very quickly that these questions are more difficult than he had confronted before, though he was sure that they would eventually be able to find an answer, so he promised a deep dive. But after just a couple weeks, perhaps a couple months of work, Roberts realizes that this is a big problem they have to confront. So he writes a letter to the First Presidency in December of 1921, requesting that they all gather together to debate. And I think this is important, and because this is in my series of talking about the historian's craft, I'm going to show you the documentation itself. So this comes from Roberts' December 1921 letter. As I proceeded with my recent investigations, however, and more especially in the, to me, new fields of language problems, I found the difficulties more serious than I had thought for. And the more I investigated, the more difficult I found the formulation of an answer. I therefore concluded not to undertake an answer to his questions on my own account, but decided to make a study of all the problems he submitted, somewhat enlarging upon them as I proceeded, and then submit the results of my investigation to all of you who are addressed at the head of this communication, and from the greater learning of the individual members of the Quorum of the 12, or from the collective wisdom of all the brethren addressed, or from the inspiration of the Lord as it may be received through the appointed channels of the priesthood of his church, we might find such a solution of the problems presenting in the accompanying correspondence. I assure you that I am most thoroughly convinced of the necessity of all the brethren herein addressed becoming familiar with these Book of Mormon problems and finding forth answers for them, as it is a matter that will concern the faith of the youth of the church now as also in the future, as well as such casual inquiries as may come to us from the outside world. It should be clear the deep anxiety that's embedded within that letter, and sadly the discussions don't go as Roberts had hoped. Church leadership called a meeting to take place in the early days of January 1922, and in preparation for that meeting, Roberts produced the first of these important Book of Mormon documents, this one titled Book of Mormon Difficulties of Study. It's 141 pages that he then read to the entire groups. The meeting was spread across 2 days. It was started from early, went till late. It was lots of long-winded discussion, but very little solutions, and Roberts came away dissatisfied. This is how he wrote to church leadership. Quote, I was very greatly disappointed over the net results of the discussion. There was so much said that was utterly irrelevant, and so little said, if anything at all, that was helpful in the matters at issue that I came away from the conference quite disappointed. He continued to meet with several leaders and then had one more meeting with a broader body later on that month. And then, smaller gatherings, but he still came away dissatisfied with their solutions. He even related one conversation he had with the Mormon apostle Richard Lyman, in which Lyman apparently asked him whether these problems would raise or lessen the difficulties. And Roberts responded to Lyman saying, "My answer was that they would very greatly increase our difficulties," on which Lyman then responded that "I do not know, we should consider them." So Roberts felt he was not receiving the support he needed for these answers. And so eventually he wrote up a kind of his reflections on this. Wants to send a long letter to church leadership, though he never does, but he drafts this March 1922 letter, kind of summarizing where they were in the process. And again, this is an important document, so I'm going to put it up on the screen here. In writing out this, my report to you of those studies, I have written it from the viewpoint of an open mind, investigating the facts of the Book of Mormon origin and authorship. Let me say once and for all, so as to avoid what might otherwise call for repeated explanation, that what is herein set forth does not represent any conclusions of mine. The report herewith submitted is what it purports to be, namely a study of Book of Mormon origins, for the information of those who ought to know everything about it, pro and con, as well as that which has been produced against it. I do not say my conclusions for them are undrawn. It may be of great importance, since it represents what may be used by some opponents in criticism of the Book of Mormon. I am taking the position that our faith is not only unshaken, but unshakable in the Book of Mormon, and therefore we can look without fear upon all that can be said against it. That he chose not to send this letter tells us a lot. That he, on the one hand, he remained convinced that the Book of Mormon can be defended. On the other hand, he does not think that they have come up with a satisfactory answer to these questions raised about the Book of Mormon and its historicity. Finally, Roberts writes a long-anticipated letter to William Ryder. Remember, the guy who started this whole process when he sent the questions to James Talmage. He wrote a long summary of the problems, assured that there was an answer, but not committed to any potential solution. Ryder responded, thanking him for his proposals, but then asks another question, and I think this is just an interesting side note. His next question that he wants Roberts to tackle is, why can't the Negro hold the priesthood? Sadly, it's going to take several more decades for that one to be answered. In the meantime, Roberts was still searching for answers on the Book of Mormon. So B.H. Roberts left those January 1922 meetings in which church leaders could not provide satisfactory solutions to these questions concerning the Book of Mormon, still convinced that he could find those solutions. He was eventually given the choice of new positions within the church, and he chose to lead the church's Eastern States mission, headquartered in New York, in part so he could do further research. And as he was out in New York, reading more into the literature that dug into the Book of Mormon and its context in early America, he discovered Ethan Smith's book, View of the Hebrews, a work published in 1823 that also argued that the Native Americans were descendants of Israelites. And Roberts found striking parallels. So at the conclusion of his mission, he decided to stay out in New York more and write this longer study comparing the View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon, as well as addressing other issues related to the Book of Mormon historicity. And he then produced a 284-page essay titled A Study of Book of Mormon. This is the second document that goes along Book of Mormon Problems of Study that he wrote in 1922. Here's a new edition, 284 pages, and it is also very provocative. Here's one excerpt to give you a taste. Did Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews furnish structural material for Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon? It has been pointed out in these pages that there are many things in the former book that might well have suggested many major things in the other. Not a few things merely, one or two, or half dozen, but many. And it is this fact of many things of similarity and the cumulative force of them that makes them so serious a menace to Joseph Smith's story of the Book of Mormon origins. And Roberts, recognizing that 284 pages is a long work, he then also creates an 18-page summary titled A Parallel. So there we get the three documents that comprise together make his studies of the Book of Mormon. The Book Book of Mormon Difficulties, a study, his Book of Mormon Study that he wrote, the 284-page version, and now the 18-page parallel. He takes all of them and he sends them along with the unsent March 1922 letter that I mentioned earlier to several Mormon leaders, including that Apostle Richard Lyman in 1927. And this is how he summarizes, quote, "I thought I would submit in sort of tabloid form a few pages of matter pointing out a possible theory of the origin of the Book of Mormon that is quite unique and never seems to have occurred to anyone to employ, largely on account of the obscurity of the material on which it might be based, but which in the hands of a skillful opponent could be made, in my judgment, very embarrassing. Such a question as that may possibly arise someday, and if it does, it would be greatly to the advantage of our future defenders of the faith if they had in hand a thorough digest of the subject matter." So that's how we get the 3 documents of B.H. Roberts, the 1922 essay that he wrote in preparation for the meetings, the 284-page essay that he wrote on View of the Hebrews, and then the parallel document that he kind of summarizes many of those similarities. So now to the million-dollar question, the issue that is going to animate the Mormon historians in the 1970s and 80s when they discover these documents. Did B.H. Roberts, one of the foremost defenders of the church, its doctrine, and especially its scripture, come to lose faith in the Book of Mormon historicity? Let me offer some of the competing views here. On the one hand, represented in a reminiscence that comes from one of B.H. Roberts' former missionaries who claims that they met with Roberts in the final years of his life. He dies in 1933, and discover his problems with the Book of Mormon, and they give an account that make it seem like he lost his faith. This is what B.H. Roberts allegedly said to that missionary when discussing his Book of Mormon text. "It's an article too strong for the average church member, but for the intellectual group, he considers it a contribution to assist in explaining Mormonism. He swings to a psychological explanation of the Book of Mormon and shows that the plates were not objective, but subjective with Joseph Smith, and his exceptional imagination qualified him psychologically for the experience which he had in presenting to the world the Book of Mormon, and the plates with the Urim and Thummim as not objective." Now, on the one hand, you can see how this work fits in to the broader modernist scholarship that B.H. Roberts was a fan of, that this is a psychological reality for the religious practitioners, but does not have any place in the material world. I have some reasons to doubt this account that I won't go too deep into, especially due to the broader context. But this is what represents, on the one hand, yes, B.H. Roberts lost faith in the Book of Mormon. He took a psychological approach that the plates weren't real, but in reality, there were creation in Joseph's mind, but there's some scriptural truth, some ideas that are found in some liberal Latter-day Saints. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence of B.H. Roberts continuing to argue that the Book of Mormon was historical and true, and was that there were actual gold plates, and that he spoke in public and in private settings in ways that does not really give credence to the idea that he gave up his faith in the Book of Mormon. In fact, to argue that B.H. Roberts privately lost faith in the Book of Mormon, but publicly stepped preaching it, is giving B.H. Roberts a degree of duplicity and an unsystematic view of things that really does not match what I see as B.H. Roberts as a defender. For me, I think several things can be true, and they can all make sense within the broader context of modernist scholarship. One, Roberts is taking a pragmatic approach to religion, recognizing that we may not know the final full answers, but we're searching for it, and it's importantly, to use modern scholarship to interrogate these ideas, which made him open to critiques while still desiring to hold on to fundamental claims. So I think, to me, this is my interpretation, I think Roberts was able to see two things as true. He wants to believe the Book of Mormon as a true historical work. He also does not think we have the full explanations that answer these questions yet, and he wants to answer them. So what's most telling to me are some of his final reflections in the first essay he wrote in those 3 documents that become his studies of the Book of Mormon. This is important enough that I'll put the quote on the screen. "What is to be our general standing before the enlightened opinion of mankind? Is silence to be our answer? Again, will will occur to thoughtful minds the difficulties attendant upon silence. In the last analysis of things, silence would be an acknowledgement of defeat. Silence in an age of free inquiry is impossible. An appeal to the old writer is of little value. The recent accepted authoritative writers leave us, so far as I at present see, no ground of appeal or defense. The new knowledge seems to be against us. To stand up and say to the modern world, we place our revealed truth against all the evidence and deductions of your science and await the vindication of new evidence yet to be discovered is heroic. But is it, and will it be convincing? Most humbly, but also most anxiously, I await the further development of knowledge that will make it possible for us to give a reasonable answer to those who question us concerning the matters herein discussed. So a few thoughts there that I think are important that reveal a lot about B.H. Roberts. He's arguing that Mormons must be engaged with this science. They must be asking these questions. They must be interrogating. And their current answers are unconvincing, which means we can't just stick to those current answers. We must move forward and find something else. He also seems to imply that answers are still possible. Right now, it does not square with the scientific consensus, but we should go forward and still find those. And so, to me, that's why I don't find the argument that Roberts is publicly lying and privately doubting to be very convincing, because that doesn't match this very analysis that he himself is offering. Instead, I think he is the same both privately and publicly. He does not think the modern explanations for the Book of Mormon work, but he's still convinced that they will be able to find answers that will work, even if they don't now. And the context of modernism allowed those competing ideas to exist simultaneously for him. So now we finally made it to the 1970s and 1980s, the Mormon history wars that's at the center of the series that I'm currently doing. Rumors of Roberts' works on the Book of Mormon circulated ever since his last years, all the way up to the 1970s. In fact, there are some references to it and some people saying that there are some documents that the church is not wanting us to see. And then in 1979 and 1981, members of the B.H. Roberts family donated a majority of his papers to the University of Utah libraries, and they brought special attention in donating those works to the Book of Mormon manuscripts, which they wished to see published, which caused a bit of a dilemma, not just for church members, not just for academics, but even for the library, because remember, B.H. Roberts did not plan on those documents to be public. He presented them to church leaders, saying that this is meant to be a private form of asking questions, and my solutions are in no way binding. He even confesses that I'm making arguments here that I myself in some cases don't believe, but in order to make the case for us to confront, I am making them. Eventually, the University of Utah Library worked with the family, with scholars, and with the community. They gathered supplemental materials to place it in context, including the correspondence that prompted the study, and then published the first edition of the book in 1985 with the University of Illinois Press. Here is what that cover looked like. Then Signature Books published a second edition a few years later. That's the edition that I and many others use that I strongly recommend. It, of course, prompted a mini crisis within church leadership, because here seemed to be evidence that one of their foremost defenders, theologians, and leaders doubting the historical reality of the Book of Mormon. And it raised questions about the Book of Mormon itself, not just of church leadership, but of the Book of Mormon. And if Roberts lost faith in the Book of Mormon, others might as well. And so there were split reactions. On the one hand, you saw plenty of progressives and critics saying, here is evidence that A, the Book of Mormon can't stand on its own 2 feet, and B, one of the leading church intellectuals also lost faith in the Book of Mormon. Whereas apologists tried to, place it within context. Truman Madsen, one of the foremost church apologists, wrote an essay in the Ensign, here you see here, arguing that B.H. Roberts remained a staunch believer in the Book of Mormon until his death. You see the academic apologists like those of Farms, Foundation of Ancient Research, and Mormon Studies producing several works on the topic. Here is an essay written by Jack Welch, the founder of Farms, in the Church News. And what you see is these split B.H. Robertses. The critics B.H. Roberts, who is very devoted to his criticism of the Book of Mormon and can't believe that the Book of Mormon can be true. And then you have the apologist B.H. Roberts, who is very much devoted, doesn't have questions about the Book of Mormon. He is a model of critical inquiry. What gets lost in those debates is the context, that modernist quest for knowledge that rejects finality that I believe is so crucial to B.H. Roberts' views. So I think what we get in the history wars of the 1980s, and I'll put some links to a few of those examples, those in the video description, is you get a B.H. Roberts that's representative of either camp, but not a B.H. Roberts that's representative of the progressive era of modernist scholarship. And that's how history sometimes gets lost in the fray of contemporary concerns. So let me close this video, which I hope you found useful, and if so, hit the like button and share with others. I'm going to close this video with a few key takeaways. First, the B.H. Roberts part of the story. I don't think B.H. Roberts concluded the Book of Mormon was false, but I also don't think he found the church's explanations for the Book of Mormon convincing and persuasive, and that they needed to search for new ones. I think he was certain that more research had to be done, and he hoped that that research will eventually vindicate the Book of Mormon, even if their research at the moment did. And I also think the story is important to understand how historians approach these topics. When we lose that context, the modernist context of the early 1900s, and instead try to place these debates in our contemporary context, like the 1980s Mormon history wars, we lose sight of the text and the figures and create a B.H. Roberts for our day rather than his day. Now, if you want to learn more about this topic, I strongly recommend the signature volume Studies of the Book of Mormon, which have the letters that were written by Ryder, by Talmage, by B.H. Roberts, and details concerning those meetings. I also strongly recommend the wonderful biography by John Solito, B.H. Roberts, A Life in the Public Arena, published by Signature Books a few years ago. If you want just to dive into the topics, I strongly recommend the Mormon R website, which has lots of the documents, even if they take an apologetic bent. I think they do a great job of presenting a lot of the material so that you can come to a conclusion yourself. If you want a narrative that focuses on those January 1922 meetings, Shannon Montez wrote an MA thesis at the University of Nevada, Reno on those meetings that you can find online. I'll link to it in the video description. And if you want to get a taste of the history wars over B.H. Roberts, I'm also adding links to essays by George Smith, representing the much more critical lens, as well as by Jack Welch, representing the more apologetic defense. I think B.H. Roberts reminds us why history remains as relevant as it is today as it has ever before. That's why we fight over these stories and dissect these words and unpack these documents, because it tells us a lot about our traditions, where we come from, even if in the end it ends reflecting who we are today.